Duarte's people say they're looking into it. Not to worry. Not blaming us. Everything in the other man's body told Dawes not to press further, and he was almost ready to let it go. He could change the angle of attack, at least. How is it all the other colonies are fighting to grow enough food, not have their hydroponics collapse like on Welker, but Laconia's already got a manufacturing base? Just means it's better planned, better funded. The thing you don't understand about this pinche Martian Duarte is... Dawes' hand terminal blatted out an alert. High priority connection request. The channel he used for station emergencies. Captain Shadid. He held up a finger, asking Rosenfeld's patience, and accepted the connection. "What's the matter?" he said instead of hello. Shadid was at her desk. He recognized the wall behind her. "I need you down here. One of my men is in the hospital. Medic says he may not make it. I have the shooter in custody." "Good that you caught him. His name's Filipinaros." Dawes felt a weight drop into his gut. "I'll be right there." Shadid had given the boy his own cell. She'd been wise to do so. From the moment he walked into the security station, Dawes had felt the shock and rage like a charge in the atmosphere. Shooting a security officer on Ceres was a short way to an airlock, or it would have been, for most people. "I put an automated monitor on him," Shadid said. "Slaved it to my system. No one else turns it on or off." "Because," Dawes said. He was sitting at her desk. She might be the head of security, but he was the governor of Ceres. "They'd turn it off," Shadid said. "And you wouldn't ever see that little piece of shit alive again. And, just between us, you'd be doing the universe a favor." On the screen, Filipinaro sat against the cell wall, his head tilted back and his eyes closed. He was a young man, or an old child. As Dawes watched, the boy stretched, wrapped his arms around himself, and settled back without looking around once. He couldn't tell if it was the movement of someone certain that they were untouchable, or frightened that they might not be. Dawes could see the resemblance to Marco, but where the father seemed to radiate charm and confidence, the son was all rage, and a vulnerability that made Dawes think of abrasions and raw wounds. Under other circumstances, he might have felt sorry for the prisoner. "How did it happen?" Dawes asked. Shadid tapped on her hand terminal and threw the data to the screen. A corridor outside a nightclub up near the center of Spin. A door swung open, and 3 people came out, all belters. A man and woman, their hands caressing each other like they were already in private, and a second young man. A moment later, the door opened again, and Filipinaro stepped out. There was no sound, so Dawes didn't know what Philip had shouted at the retreating figures, only that he had. The single young man turned back, and the couple paused to watch. Philip's head was back, his chest out. For generations, humanity had been free of the gravity well of the inner planets, but the posturing of young men spoiling for a fight never changed. A new figure stepped into the frame. A man in a security uniform, hands lifted in command. Philip turned toward him, shouting. The security man shouted back, pointed to the wall, ordering Philip against it. The couple turned away and pretended not to know anything about it. The young man who'd been coming back to the fight slowly stepped back, not turning away, but willing to let his enemies spend themselves against each other. Philip went terribly still. Dawes had to force himself not to look away. The security man reached for his weapon, and a gun appeared in Philip's hand, the kind of magic flicker that comes of hundreds of hours of practicing a fast draw. And then, as part of the same motion, the muzzle flash. God damn it, Dawes said. It's not subtle, Shadid said. He was given a security order. He refused and fired on the agent. If he was anyone else, he'd be feeding mushrooms right now. Dawes pressed his palm to his mouth, rubbing until his lips felt bruised. There had to be something, some way to walk this back. How's your man? There was a pause before Shadid answered. She knew what he was really asking. Stabilized. Not going to die? Not out of the woods yet either, she said. And then, I can't do my job if people get away with shooting security. I understand there's diplomacy involved, but with respect, that's your job. Mine is to keep 6 million people from killing too many of each other on any given day. My job's not so different, he thought. This wasn't the time to say it. Contact Marco Inaros. He'd be on the Pella in Dock 65C, Dawes said. Tell him to meet me here. At the end of particularly bad days, Dawes would sometimes pour himself a glass of whiskey and sit for a time with his prized possession, a printed volume of Marcus Aurelius that had belonged to his grandmother. The Meditations were the private thoughts of a person with terrible power, an emperor who could order to death anyone he chose, create the law by speaking it, command any woman to his bed, or any man if the mood took him. The thin pages were filled with Aurelius's private struggle to be a good man, despite the frustrations of the world. It left Dawes feeling not comforted, but consoled. All through human history, being a moral person and not being pulled into the dramatics and misbehavior of others had caused intelligent people grief. Dawes had spent decades with that beneath all his personal philosophy. There were bad people everywhere, stupidity and avarice and hubris and pride, and he had to navigate it, if there was ever to be hope for a better place for Belters. It wasn't that things were worse now than they'd been before, only that they weren't better. Tonight, he suspected, would be a good one for rereading his Aurelius. Marco swept into the security station like he owned it, smiles and laughter, and a sheer animal presence that filled the space. The security agents unconsciously moved to the edges of the room and didn't meet his gaze. Dawes went out to lead him back to Shadid's office and found himself shaking the man's hand there in front of everyone. He hadn't meant to do that. This is embarrassing, Marco said, as if he was agreeing with something that had already been said. I will see that it doesn't happen again. Your son could have killed one of my people, Dawes said. Marco sat back in his chair and opened his arms, an expansive gesture that seemed intended to diminish what anyone else could say. There was a scuffle and it got out of hand. Dawes, tell me you've never had something like it. I've never had something like it, Dawes said. His voice was cool and hard, and for the first time, Marco's jovial expression shifted. You aren't going to make this a problem, are you? Marco said, his voice sinking low. We have a lot of work to do. Real work. Words come that Earth took out the Azure Dragon. We have to reassess our strategy down sunward. It was the first Dawes had heard of it, and he had the sense that Marco had kept the information private, ready to play it when he wanted a subject changed. Well, he'd find Dawes harder to throw off than that. And we will. But that's not why I called you here. Shadid coughed and Marco turned to scowl at her. When he looked back at Dawes, his expression had changed. His smile was as wide, his expression as open and merry. But something in his eyes made Dawes' stomach clench. All right, Marco said. Bien, Koyomis. Why did you call me here? Your son can't be on my station, Dawes said. If he stays, I have to put him through a trial. Have to protect him from anyone who might get impatient waiting. He paused. Have to follow through the sentence, if there is one. Marco went still. A copy of his son on the assault footage. Dawes made an effort not to swallow. That sounds like a threat, Anderson. It's an explanation. It's why you need to take your boy off my station and never bring him back to it. I'm doing this as a favor. Anyone else, and things would just take their course. Marco drew in a long, slow breath and let it out between his teeth. I see. He shot a security agent. He may have killed him. We've killed a world, Marco said, waving the words away. But then he seemed to remember something, nodding as much to himself as to Dawes or Shadid. But I appreciate your bending the rules for me. And for him. I won't let this go by. He and I will have a serious conversation. All right, Dawes said. Captain Shadid will release him to you. If you want to bring some of your people down before she does, that won't be necessary, Marco said. No bodyguards were called for. None of the security force would dare face down Marco Inaros of the Free Navy. And, what was worse, Dawes believed Marco was right. We'll have a meeting tomorrow about the Azure Dragon and Earth. Next steps. Next steps, Dawes agreed and stood. You know, this isn't temporary. Philip can never set foot on Ceres again. Marco's smile was unexpected and deep. His dark eyes flashed. Don't worry, old friend. If you don't want him here, he won't be here. That's a promise. Chapter 9. Holden. The sound reached all the way to the galley. A deep thud, then a pause, then another thud. Each time it came, Holden felt himself flinch a little. Naomi and Alex sat with him, trying to ignore it. But whatever they started a conversation about, the state of the ship, the success of their mission, the question of whether to give in to fate and convert a section of the crew quarters into a brig, it died out under the slow, unending beat. Maybe I should talk to her, Holden said. I think I should. Don't know why you think that, Alex said. Naomi shrugged, abstaining. Holden took one last bite of his fake lamb, wiped his mouth with the napkin, and dropped everything into the recycler. Part of him hoped that one of them would stop him. They didn't. The Rocinante's gym showed its age. No two resistance bands were quite the same color. The green-gray mats had white lines where the fabric had worn thin, and the smell of old sweat softened the air. Bobby had strung a heavy bag on a tight line between the ceiling and the deck. Her exercise outfit was tight and gray and soaked with sweat. Her hair was tied back, and her eyes were locked on the bag as she shifted on the balls of her feet. As Holden stepped into the room, she turned to the left, putting her weight into a roundhouse kick. This close, the thud sounded like something heavy being dropped. The system reported a little under 95 kilograms per square centimeter. Bobby danced back, her focus locked on the bag. She shifted to the right and kicked with the other leg. The thud was a little softer, but the reading went up by 3 kilos. She danced back, reset. Her shins were red and raw-looking. Hey, she said, not looking at him. Thud, reset. Hey, Holden said. How are you doing? Fine. Thud, reset. Anything you want to talk about? Thud, reset. Nope. Okay, well, if you, thud, reset. Change your mind. I'll track you down. Thud, reset, thud. Great, Holden said, and stepped back out of the room. Bobby hadn't looked at him once. In the galley, Naomi had a bulb of coffee waiting for him. He sat across from her while Alex dropped the last of his food into the recycler. Holden drank. The Rossi's processors were calibrated once a week, and they'd stocked up before leaving Luna, so it was almost certainly his imagination that made the coffee more bitter than usual. He put a pinch of salt in it anyway, swirling the bulb to stir it. "You knew that wasn't going to work," he said. "I expected it wasn't," Naomi said. "I didn't know. Just suspected." "Strongly suspected," she said. It was almost an apology. "I could have been surprised." "You got to give Bobby her room, Cap," Alex said. "She'll come out the other side of it." I wish I understood what's bothering her so much." Alex blinked. "She's been spoiling to take the fight to some bad guys ever since Io. Now she got one, and she was stuck in a box while the rest of us did the shooting. But we won." "We did," Naomi said. "And she watched us do it while we tried to figure out how to get her out of a trap. By the time she was free, it was over." Holden sipped at the coffee. It was a little better. That didn't help. "Okay, so what I meant was I wish I understood what was bothering her in hopes that then there'd be something I could do about it." "We know," Naomi said. "The difficulty isn't lost on us." Amos's voice came over the ship's comm. "Anybody there? I've been paging ops for the last 10 minutes. Alex thumbed the system on. "On my way up now." "Okay, I think I tracked down the last leak. Let me know what it looks like from your end." "Will do," Alex said, nodded at the two of them, and headed up toward ops and the ongoing repair effort. The Azure Dragon's crew hadn't had all that long, but they hadn't been trying for clean either. It was easier to cut through a lot of hull quickly when you didn't care what broke while you did it. Knowing that the ship wasn't right yet was like an itch he couldn't quite reach. Part of that came from knowing how strapped the shipyards on Luna were going to be. The days of sloping into Tycho and having Fred Johnson's teams patch the ship up were probably gone, and Luna had Earth's Navy to take precedence over Holden and his crew. It wasn't just that, though. It was also the same thing he'd felt driving him to talk to Bobby. And to Clarissa Mao before that. He wanted things to be all right, and he had the growing feeling that they weren't. That they weren't going to be. "What about you?" Naomi said, looking at him from under a spill of dark, gently curled hair. "Want to talk?" He chuckled. "I do, but I don't know what to say. Here we are, the conquering heroes with prisoners and a salvaged data core, and it doesn't feel like enough." "It isn't. Always so comforting. I mean, you're not wrong. You aren't uneasy and disturbed by all this because there's something wrong with you. This is all uneasy and disturbing. You aren't fucked up. The situation is. That doesn't... You know, that actually does make me feel a little better." "Good," she said. "Because I need to know this isn't about Marco and Philip. That all that isn't making it hard for you to have me around." "No," Holden said. "We covered that. And we'll cover it again after this, I'm sure. But if you just keep saying it, I would put everyone else that exists head first out an airlock just to keep you around. It isn't that. The only concern I have about you and Marco Inaros is that he'll try to hurt you again. That's nice to know. I still love you. I will always love you." He was answering the question he thought she was asking, but her gaze cut away. Her smile was rueful, but it was also real. "Always is a long time. I'm captain of this ship. Technically, I could marry us right now." Now she laughed. "Would you want to? I'm easy. It seems a little redundant. Husband and wife seems like a less interesting and committed relationship than Holden and Naomi, he said. He can't win, you know. Of course he can. Marco's the one who decides when he wins. No, I've been thinking about it. The Free Navy is untenable. They did a lot of damage, they killed a lot of people. But all of this is really about the gates. If it wasn't for all the people rushing out to try to found a new colony, Mars wouldn't be collapsing. The Belters wouldn't be worried that they'll get marginalized out of existence. None of the things that gave Marco a toehold would have happened. But the gates aren't going away. So all the pressures he's fighting against, they'll outlast him. People are still going to want to get out to the new systems, and they're going to find ways to do it. And the colonies that are already out there are going to want to keep in contact and trade with us. At least until they're really on their feet, and that could take generations. You think he's on the wrong side of history? He is, Holden said. Then what does that say about people like me? I grew up in the belt. I wouldn't want to live down a gravity well. The gates aren't going away, but neither are the Belters. Unless they are. What do you mean? She shrugged. Human history has seen plenty of genocides. If you're right, then the long term is either the gates or the Belters. And Belters, we're human. We're fragile. We die. The gates? Even if we could destroy them, we wouldn't. There's too much real estate involved. Holden looked down. All right. That was my turn. Naomi lifted a questioning eyebrow. That was less comforting than I meant it to be, he said. Sorry. It's all right. Anyway, that's not what I meant when I said Marco decides when he wins. You don't understand how slippery he can be. Whatever happens, he'll shift it, so it was his plan all along. If he were the last person alive, he'd say, we needed the apocalypse, and declare victory. It's what he is. Even though they were the agents of Christian Avasarala's will, it took 17 hours for the Rocinante and the Azure Dragon to get berths on Luna. When they finally did, they were at a military yard outside Patsayev complex, where the civilian relief ships were landing. The docks were crowded with people in bunches and lines, some of them staring blankly ahead like victims of a fever, some weeping with relief or exhaustion, or both. The air stank of sweat and felt stale, even where the intakes made the greatest breeze. The Luna Station complex, shipyards and convention centers, hotels and residence centers, schools and office complexes and warehouses, was big enough to fit 100 million bodies. But the environmental infrastructure would overload at something like half that, even with the advantage of the moon's mass and conduction to soak up waste heat. The Lagrange stations had less margin. Holden tried to do the math in his head as they forged their path through the crowd. The estimate said that 1/2 of Earth was dead already. 15 billion gone, or going so fast there was no way to save them. Of those still alive, 2/3 were living in what the news feeds were calling distressed situations. 10 billion people who needed food, or water, or shelter. And up the well, there were places for maybe as many as 250,000. 2.5 thousandths of a percent of the people in need. He couldn't believe that was right, and tried to figure it again. He came to the same number. And 1,000 worlds out there, just on the other side of the gate. Hostile worlds, most of them, but not more hostile than Earth. Not now. If there were a way to teleport them from Boston and Lisbon and Bangkok, maybe they'd be saved. Maybe they'd go on to raise something new and beautiful out of the ruins of Earth. And if one system didn't, there'd be 1,000 other chances. Except that there wouldn't be, because the transportation was too hard. So they'd die where they stood, because there was no way to get them all someplace better fast enough for it to matter. "You okay, Cap?" Amos asked. "Fine. Why?" "Looks like you're getting ready to hit someone." "No," Holden said. "Wouldn't help." "Over here," Bobby said. The guards outside the administrative offices carried small automatic weapons and wore body armor. They stood aside and let Bobby shuffle through the wide gray door and all of the others behind her in a line like ducklings. The offices could have been a different world. Full-spectrum lights glowed like Holden's memory of a summer afternoon. Ferns and ivy bobbed in the gentle breeze from the air recyclers. The hallways were half a meter wider than the corridors of the Rocinante and felt luxurious. Only the faint gunpowder stink of moon dust and the 1/10th G spoke of Luna. Everything else would have looked at home in the UN offices at The Hague. Bobby led them like she knew where she was going. Down one hall, past another pair of armed guards, and through a set of frosted glass doors. The room was built like a lounge. Chairs and divans around low tables. 8 or 10 people were scattered around in pairs and small groups, and for a few seconds, Holden didn't understand who they were. At some point, everything had been either black or white, but use had left splashes of color. The brown ring of a coffee stain on a cushion. The greenish scrape along the side of a chair. Avasarala stood at the far side of the room, her orange sari blazing like a torch while she talked to a white-haired woman with dark skin and narrow hips. When Avasarala looked up to smile at him, the woman turned. Holden stumbled. "Mama Sophie?" he said. And then, like a lens coming into focus, he saw all the others for who they were. The years had changed them all, and seeing them through cameras and screens wasn't the same. Father Tom had gained weight, and Father Cesar had lost it, but they were there, hand in hand, walking toward him. Father Anton had gone bald, and Mother Elise seemed older and frailer in person than she had on the screen, and shorter. Everyone seemed shorter, because the system at the farmhouse had been on a desk. He'd been looking up at all of them from that desktop for years, and hadn't realized it until just now. All 8 of his parents crowded around him, their bodies pressing gently against his, their arms around each other, the way they had when he'd been a child. Holden found himself weeping, swept away by the memory of being a little boy surrounded and protected by the loving bodies of 8 strong adults. He stood among them now, the strongest of the lot, shaken by the love and the joy and the terrible understanding that both the boy he'd been and the men and women they were then were gone and would never come back. They were all crying too. Father Dimitri, Mother Tamara, Father Joseph, and his new family too. Naomi pressed her hand to her lips, like she was trying to hold words or emotions in. Alex was grinning as widely as any of Holden's family, his eyes shining. Avasarala and Bobby seemed pleased, like people who pulled off a good surprise party. Weirdly, Clarissa Mao, standing alone with a pressure cast on her wounded arm, was shaking with barely controlled sobs. Amos looked at them all like he'd walked in on the last line of a joke, then shrugged and let them get on with whatever the hell this was. Holden felt a rush of affection for the man. "Wait," he said. "Wait. Everyone, I need you to meet everyone else, I guess. This is Naomi, everyone." His parents all turned toward her. Naomi's eyes widened a degree. The little panicked flare of her nostrils was probably something only he could see. There was a pause he hadn't expected. A stuttering moment when he saw through their eyes. Here is the Belter girl their son was sleeping with. Here is the ex-lover of the man who killed the world. the representative of everything that had happened. One of them. It lasted a heartbeat, then another. It was vast as the space between worlds. "I've heard so much about you, dear," Mother Elise said, moving to Naomi and taking her in a wide embrace. The others followed, queuing up to welcome her to the family. But it wasn't an illusion. The moment had been there. Even when his two families diffused into each other, Father Dimitri and Father Anton and Alex talking about the ship, Mother Tamara and Amos looking at each other with a kind of amused bewilderment, Holden felt the hesitation. They would love her, if he said so, but she wasn't one of their kind. He barely noticed Bobby at his side until she spoke. "This is how she does it. She finds a way to pay you." She nodded toward the back of the room. Avasarala stood alone, watching with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Holden went to her. "They told me they were all right," he said. "When I talked to them, they said they weren't in danger." "It was true, as far as it went," Avasarala said. "The reactors hadn't failed there yet, and they had more food stored than most. They might have lasted another month. How should I know? Canning. Who the fuck does their own canning anymore? But you evacuated them. Another week, another month, not another year. They wouldn't have been safe forever. And once they realized they were fucked, all the slots would have been filled. I flagged them as priority evacuees. I get to do that kind of shit. I'm the boss. Where? She shrugged. They'll have quarters here or on L4. Not as big as they have in Montana, but together. I can do that much. Maybe they'll even go back to their farm someday when all this is done. Stranger things have happened. Holden took her hand. It was cool and hard and stronger than he'd expected. She turned to look him in the eye for the first time since he'd come into the room. The smile edged into the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," he said. "I owe you one." Her smile shifted, losing the formality and coolness and distance it had carried beneath the surface. She chuckled deep in her throat. "I know," she said. Chapter 10. Avasarala. She didn't sleep anymore. Or at least, it didn't help when she did. The bed in her suite was spongy, but she didn't sink into it the way that a lifetime at normal gravity made her body expect, so it felt too soft and too hard at the same time. And sleep was supposed to mean rest. There was no rest anymore. She closed her eyes, and her mind stumbled on like it was falling downstairs. Mortality rates, and supply windows, and security briefings, all the things that filled her so-called waking hours, filled her nights as well. Being asleep only meant they lost what little coherence they had. It didn't feel like sleeping. It felt like going mad and catatonic for a few hours, and then regaining enough sanity to push through for 18 or 20 hours more before collapsing into herself again. It was shit, but it needed doing, so she did it. At least she had a shower. "It seems like Bobby Draper managed to keep Holden from screwing the mission up," she said, drying her hair. The suite glowed a soft blue, like the promise of dawn. Not that any dawn looked like that on Earth now, but it had, once. I liked that girl. I worry for her. She's been sitting behind a desk too long. It doesn't suit her. She considered the saris in her dresser, running her finger across the cloth and listening to the sound of skin against fabric. She opted for a green one that shimmered like a beetle's carapace. Gold embroidery along the edges that caught the false sunlight made it look cheerful and powerful at the same time. And she had the amber necklace with the jade that went with it. Fashion. All humanity shitting itself to death, and she still had to worry what she looked like going into the meetings. Pathetic. Aloud, she said, "Gis and Basrat sent word today. Everyone thought they were dead, but they were holed up under a mountain in the Julian Alps. Probably didn't plan to pop their heads above ground until everything was settled. But you know how Amanda is. It's never real with her unless someone knows she has it better. I don't know why you like them." She caught her mistake too late, and something vast and dangerous shifted in her heart. She took a deep breath, bit her lip, and went back to wrapping her sari in place. "Once we have the Free Navy under control, we'll have to do something about immigration. No one's going to want to stay on the earth. At this rate, I may take off, retire on some alien ocean where I don't have to feel like I'm responsible for making the waves go up and down. Mars will never sort itself out. Smith? He puts a brave face on it, but he's not a prime minister. He's hospice nurse for a republic. Anytime I start feeling like my job's bad, I just have a drink with him." They were all things she'd said before in some variation. There were new things every day. Reports from the planetary surface, from the surveillance drones around Venus, from her covert service agents on Iapetus and Ceres and Pallas. With the Free Navy busy making the OPA look measured and rational, Fred Johnson could still be of use making contact with the reservoirs of the belt that understood how dangerous Marco Inaros was, and how the damage already done could spiral into something even worse. God knew he never brought in good news. But for everything new, for every irrevocable tick of the clock, there were the things she cycled back to. The ones she revisited again and again, like rereading a favorite book or poem. Things she said because she had said them before. "There was a thing you read me one time about jack pines," she said, digging through her jewelry box for her necklace and the gold bracelets that would go with the embroidery. "Do you remember it? All I have is that it ended da-da, 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 and paved the way to paradise. It was about how the seeds needed a fire before they could spread. I told you it sounded like a sophomore girl trying to make the breakup with her abusive boyfriend sound deep. That poem. I can't get it out of my head now. And I can't remember it either. It's annoying." The bracelets slid into place. The necklace settled too lightly on her collarbone. She sat at her table, touching on eyeliner, tapping a nearly homeopathic bit of rouge onto her cheeks. Just enough to make her look more vital than she felt. Not enough to make it seem like she was wearing makeup. The smell of the rouge reminded her of the apartment in Denmark she'd kept during university. God, her mind was everywhere these days. When she finished, she turned to her hand terminal. The indicator showed she was still recording. She smiled into the camera. "I have to put the mask on now. Go wade into it all again. They still haven't found you, but I tell myself that they will. That I would know it if you were dead. I don't know it, so it isn't true. But it's getting harder now. And if you don't come back soon, I'll have saved so many of these messages, you'll spend half a semester just catching up to me." Except, she thought, there wouldn't be semesters, or poetry courses, or any of the things that had made her life hers before the rocks fell. And then, almost as if he was there, Arjun's dissenting voice murmured in her mind, "There will always be poetry." "I love you," she said to the hand terminal. "I will always love you." Even... She hadn't said it before. Hadn't let herself think it. There was a first time for everything. A last time, too. Even if you're not here. She stopped recording, repaired the damage her tears had done to the makeup, and lowered her head like an actor preparing to take the stage. When she lifted her eyes again, they were harder. She made the connection request to Saeed, and he answered immediately. He'd been waiting. "Good morning, Madam Secretary," he said. "Cut the bullshit. What fresh hell are we facing today? You have a meeting with Gorman Lay from the Scientific Service in half an hour, then breakfast with Prime Minister Smith, an interview with Karol Stepanov of the Eastern Economic Strategic Report, and then the meeting with the Strategy and Response Committee. That will last until lunch, ma'am." Stepanov. He was the one who got the Chidam Tokar Award 3 years ago for the piece on Dashiell Moraga? I can check, ma'am. For fuck's sake, Saeed, try to keep up here. He is. I'm sure of it. I should talk to his wife before I meet with him, she said. Is there a place we can push him to in the afternoon? I can make space, ma'am. Do that. And make sure Smith is a private audience. I'm sick of every fucking thing I do being under a microscope. If I get an ass polyp, I'll find out about it in Le Monde. If you say so, ma'am. I say so. Send the cart. Let's get this over with. Gorman Lay was a thin man with light brown hair salted with white and jade green eyes that Avasarala guessed were cosmetic. She hadn't known him before he came to Luna. He'd been promoted above his level of preparation when the rocks fell, and it showed in his overly somber bearing and the way he cleared his throat before he spoke. The ships that failed to complete the transition tended to be larger in mass, he said. The Oleander Swift, the Barbertan de Tubarão, and the Harmony all follow that pattern. The Casa Azul doesn't match that, though. The Science Service had always been a large presence on Luna. It was where the first broad-array telescope had been built, up free from the interference of atmosphere. The first permanent moon base had been equally divided between military posturing and research. But the generations that had risen and fallen since then had left the Lunar Science Service behind, pressing out to the places where the action really was. Ganymede, Titan, Iapetus. God help them all, Phoebe. It left the Luna-based service office hardly more than admin offices and children's science fair projects. The meeting room they were in was grey-green, with wall screens left cloudy by years of fine abrasion and fake leather chairs. I'm hearing you say there's no consistent pattern, Avasarala said. Gorman Lay pressed his jaw tight and flapped his hands in frustration. There are patterns. There are any number of patterns. They all had drives built within a 20-month window. They were all using reaction mass harvested from Saturn. They all went missing in high traffic periods. They all had the sequence 4521 in their long-form registry codes. With this little to go on, I can find as many patterns as you want that match all the missing ships. But which one matters? No, I can't tell you that. Any ships with 4521 in the registry code make it through? Gorman Lay made a small huffing sound, like an angry hamster, then looked down and blushed. The Yakaneta registered out of Ganymede. It went through between the Oleander Swift and the Harmony. Reported back from Walton with no trouble. Well, Avasarala said, amused that he'd actually tracked that down. We can easily say that one's less likely to be it then. Yes, ma'am, Gorman Lay said. Ma'am, if we could get further data, I'm certain that Medina Station has flight records for all of these, maybe others, and for the ones that didn't have trouble. If we could just... If we controlled Medina Station, Avasarala said, a lot of things would be different. Do we have anything from our Martian friends about why their rogue navy was so interested in the Laconia Gate? Not even confirmation that that's where the breakaway ships went. Avasarala scowled. Keeping their knees closed after they're already fucked. Typical. I'll talk to Smith. We can't get Medina, but we should fucking well manage access to all the data we do have. Thank you, ma'am, Gorman-Lay said. But he said it to her back. She was already moving on. Motion helped. The sense of doing things, of progressing, of the problems getting clearer and the solutions, where there were any, getting closer, kept the despair at bay. It was harder for Smith. He was a world away from his home and his staff. There just wasn't as much Martian infrastructure on Luna. When he wasn't in meetings or trading messages across 12 minutes of light delay, he sat in his suite and watched the news feeds, calling him an idiot and a buffoon, and the man whose inattention had let the Martian Congressional Republic Navy be sold to terrorists and pirates. He didn't even have managing the worst catastrophe in human history to keep his mind off feeling sorry for himself. He met her at the door. In simple sand-colored slacks and a white, collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled up, he could have been a salesman or a minor prelate. His smile was professionally genuine and warm, the same way it always was. She stepped into the rooms and glanced around. No one, not even security. A private audience indeed. Score one for Saeed. Their breakfast waited in the dining room. Poached eggs and thick, buttered toast. The sort of simple, elegant fare that she imagined royalty through the ages had enjoyed while the people they ruled died. She also saw the half-empty bottle of wine on the floor by the sofa. The wall screen turned to an entertainment feed, showing a slightly risque comedy that had come out 3 years earlier. Shannon Poe and Lakash Herdat were naked and trying to cover themselves with the same beach towel without looking at the other or touching skin to skin. In context, it might have been funny. Smith followed her gaze and turned off the screen. Laughter, he said. A balm in hard times. I'll have to try it, she said. He pulled her chair out for her, and she let him. I had a few things I wanted to run past you, but before that, I understand why your intelligence service is hiding information about Duarte, but why the fuck are you keeping the data about the gate-eaten ships to yourself? Are you looking to trade it for something? Because unless it's sexual favors, we haven't got jack shit. The eggs are good, Smith said. You want eggs? I'll have them squeeze a chicken. I want the data on the missing ships. Smith smiled and nodded as if she'd said something mild and polite. The pale flesh of the egg dripped gold on the way to his mouth. The yolk spattered his shirt front, but he didn't seem to notice. What is it? She asked. You'll have to take the matter up with my successor. I've had word today. The opposition is calling for a vote of no confidence. I will be out of office by this evening. Avasarala took in a deep breath and let it out through her teeth. The silence between them was rich until she broke it. Fuck. They're angry and they're frightened. They need someone to blame. I'm the obvious choice. Who are they putting up? Olivia Liu and Shahaya Nelson were both mentioned. It's going to be Emily Richards, though. Avasarala chewed a bite of egg, but didn't taste it. Richards wasn't bad. She was serious, at least. Liu and Nelson were too entrenched in what Mars had been. They wouldn't be ready for what it was becoming. Richards' women made good policy. Always had. I'm sorry, she said. This must be hard for you. Politicians are gamblers, Smith said. We do our best to bend the odds, but the universe does what it does. Bullshit, she thought. Politicians are the frontal lobes of the body politic. The universe does what it does. They'd be better off without him. Only not yet. You have a day, she said. Get me the data before it's too late. Christian, what are they going to do? Fire you? Fuck them. Give me the data so I can get the problems fixed. If they give you too much shit, I'll offer you asylum. He laughed and leaned back in his chair. His eyes shifted to the dead wall screen, then back to her. She wondered if the wine by the sofa had been his first bottle. Promise? He asked as if it was a joke. She smiled. The Strategy and Response Committee, Admirals Picea and Souther, Paris Cantor from Human Development back at The Hague, Michael Harrow from Aquaculture, Barry Lee and Simone Gutierrez from Transportation and Tariffs. Not the dream team she'd have chosen, but the best of who she had left. Sitting around the dark glass table, they all looked as tired as she felt. Good. They should be. Mars, Avasarala said. Smith is out in his ass. Emily Richards is taking over. I'm reaching out to her now. I don't know whether she'll be more open, but I wouldn't assume it. What do you have? Lee spoke first. Exhaustion made his lisp worse, but the sharpness of his intelligence made his eyes seem brighter. We're maintaining relief routes in Africa and Europe. Our next area of focus is East Asia. There weren't any strikes there, Avasarala said. But they took the worst of the ash fall, Lee said. I have my people working on routes and probable needs. Information from the ground is sketchy. The belt, she said. The belt's the belt, Picea said. There's a wide variety of response. Ganymede is still maintaining neutrality, but it's firmly in the Free Navy's sphere of control. If we could offer protection, it would likely declare for us. The OPA is divided. Tycho Station, Kelso Station, and Rhea are the only ones who condemn the Free Navy. The Trojan stations and Iapetus aren't declaring anything. Most of the rest of the belt, it's for the Free Navy. As long as they keep promising food, material, and protection, it's going to be hard for moderate belters to organize, even assuming they want to. Souther cleared his throat. He spoke in a high voice that reminded her of singing. We've taken apart the Azure Dragon's comlogs. They indicate that there's a high-level Free Navy meeting on Ceres right now. Enaros and his 4 captains. What are they meeting about? Avasarala.
Sorry, I forgot about you.
Snapped. No one seemed to know, Souther said. But we don't have evidence of a second Shepherd vessel. We've identified 7 more major rock strikes that are presently en route to Earth. We're tracking them, and we're ready to take them out. Meaning they were unpinned. Avasarala leaned forward, pressing her fingers to her lips. Her mind danced across the solar system. Medina Station. Rhea declaring against the Free Navy. The food and supplies on Ganymede. The starvation and death on Earth. The Martian Navy divided between the mysterious Duarte and his black market Free Navy, and Smith. Now, Richards. The lost colonies. Fred Johnson's OPA and all the factions he couldn't influence or command. The colony ships being preyed upon by the Free Navy pirates, and the stations and asteroids gaining the benefit of the piracy. And the missing ships. And the stolen protomolecule sample. A dozen possibilities shifted in her mind. Redeploy forces to Tycho Station and embolden Ganymede, or blockade Pallas and try to cut off the Free Navy's resupply capabilities, or set up a protected zone for the colony ships out there running dark. There were 1,000 different paths, and she couldn't be sure where any of them would lead. If she guessed wrong, it could mean the collapse of all that was left. But Marco Inaros and his captains were together in one place, and her ships weren't pinned. Fortune favors the bold, yes? She said. Fuck it. Let's take back Ceres. Chapter 11. Pa. 7 decades before Michio Pa was born, Earth and Mars rewrote the tariff regulations on raw ore from the belt. The stated reason was that it would encourage the establishment and expansion of refineries in the belt and around Jupiter and Saturn. It might even have worked. In the short term, it meant that a wave of belter prospectors and asteroid miners who'd been living at the edge of survival slipped over into the abyss. Ships were impounded, or run illegally, or lost from not having the scrip to pay for maintenance and repair. Back then, Earth and Mars had walked in each other's footsteps, and the only option that seemed to have any promise of justice was for the belt to build a military of its own. It was never official. The Outer Planets Alliance survived since then by being diffuse and deniable. But the beginnings were there. Choose a faction, find a place in the chain of command, build the thin but resilient structure that would have muscle one day, that would eventually become an answer to the inner planets projecting their power out to where the sun was hardly more than the brightest star. When Michio Pa turned 22, Fred Johnson, the butcher of Anderson Station, had seemed like her brightest hope. He was an Earther, fighting for the belt, fighting against his own natural self-interest. It gave a sense of authenticity to someone young enough and still easily swayed. She'd taken a position on Tycho Station, made her contacts first and then her commitment, trained in the quasi-military that Johnson was hauling up, put in her years. She'd been a true believer then. She'd been a naive little prig. But that was before the behemoth. Getting the XO assignment on the Belt's first genuine warship had been a dream come true for her. The generation ship hadn't been designed for war, but all of her crew had been. That was what she told herself. Captain Ashford had the command. She had been his second, and slotted in beneath them as head of security, Fred Johnson's personal friend, Carlos C. de Baca, Bull. Her babysitter, and the man positioned to step in and take over when she made her first mistake. Her hatred for Bull had been incandescent. Every chance she had to belittle him, she'd taken it. Every misstep he made, she drove a wedge into, prying it open. The behemoth had gone to the ring to face down Earth and Mars, to show that the Belt was a force to be reckoned with, and as above, so below. She'd made it her personal mission to show Bull that she was better than he was, which was why it hurt her so badly when Sam sided with him. They'd talked about it, her and Sam, how important it was to keep their affair quiet, how not to let anyone, especially anyone in command, guess about them. Sam had agreed, maybe because she actually did agree, or maybe in order to placate Michio's insecurities. And then Bull and Sam had fucked around with the budget allocations. It had felt like the deepest betrayal possible. Sam, her Sam, making common cause with an Earther. With the Earther who'd been sent by Fred Johnson to mind the untrustworthy Belters. It had been only her first mistake among many. Michio had let her emotions blind her to the wisdom and experience that Bull had offered her until things were badly out of hand. Despite all the casualties after the catastrophe, she hadn't recognized Ashford's volatility and violence as symptoms of brain injury. She hadn't put aside her faith in the chain of command. And she hadn't made peace with Sam before Ashford killed her. Fred Johnson had sent her out into the whirlwind because she was a Belter, and he needed a Belter as a figurehead. She hadn't been ready, but she had been convenient. And because of it, people had died. The behemoth never came back through the gate. They'd stripped her down, spun up the drum, and rechristened her again as Medina Station. Michio Pa they'd sent back to Tycho in a Martian naval vessel. After the dead had been removed, there'd been plenty of extra space. As soon as she'd gotten back to her quarters, she'd resigned. She didn't even shower first. She quit her official job on Tycho, her militia rank in the OPA, everything. Fred Johnson had sent her personal messages. She didn't know what was in them. She deleted them without listening. And she'd gotten lost, taking one job and another, trying to keep her nightmares and crying jags to herself. She ran a ship for a salvaging company that sometimes verged over into piracy. She oversaw a trading co-op that didn't announce itself to the tariff boards, which was technically smuggling. She was managing a supply warehouse complex on Rhea for a half-criminal labor union based out of Titan when Nadia and Bertolt found her. It had taken 6 months before she'd realized that she was in love with them, and 4 more before she understood what it meant that they loved her too. The day they first made a home together in a thin, inexpensive hole half a click below the moon's surface was one of the best she'd ever had. The others had come in their own way. Laura and Oksana together, and then Josep, Evans. Each new person folded into the marriage, had felt like an expansion of her tribe, her people. Not the politicians, not the war leaders, not the men who loved to wield power. There was a difference between, on the one hand, the belt and its fight to exist in the face of the gate she'd helped open, and on the other, the voices and bodies of her family. But the dream didn't die. Somewhere in the back of her mind, the idea of a Belter navy that could stand toe-to-toe with Earth and Mars and demand to be respected lay dormant but alive. And so, when Marco Inaros came with his proposal in hand, she'd heard him out. She was still remembered in Belter circles as the captain who'd stepped up in the slow zone. People respected her name. When the time came, he needed someone who would coordinate rounding up the colony ships he was keeping out of the slow zone and see that the supplies made it to Belters in need. Take from the rich inners and give to the poor of the belt until things were even, until they reached the utopia of the void. But not yet. Now, he just needed small favors. Moving some contraband through to Ganymede, overseeing a prisoner transfer, helping set up a band of hidden relays outside Jupiter. He had cultivated her with a grand vision and small steps. And by cultivated, she might have meant seduced. "How many ships do we have coming to Ceres?" he asked, walking beside her. The administrative levels of Ceres Station had the smell of living plants, the polished floors and walls that were meant as a boast. Michio felt a little out of place there, but Marco didn't. He managed to make wherever he was feel like his natural habitat. 7, she said. The closest's the Alistair Rausch. It's been breaking for a while. Should hit dock in 3 days. The Hornblower's the farthest, but Carmody can up the burn if we need him to. I'm trying to have the fleet conserve reaction mass. Good. That's good, Marco said, putting his hand on her shoulder. His guards stopped at the door to the conference room, and Michio started past them. Marco held her back. We're going to need to shift them. Shift them? Route them to other ports. Or run them dark and just let them be for a while. Michio shook her head. It wasn't actual rejection as much as her body expressing her confusion. 6 responses came to her. They all needed to refuel someplace. And we have stations running low on food and fertilizer that are already coming here to get it. And are you kidding me? Why? She asked. Marco's smile was warm and charming, excited and bright. She found herself smiling along with him without knowing why. Situation's changed, he said, and then walked into the conference room ahead of her. His guards nodded to her as she passed them, and she wondered for a moment where Marco's son was. The others were around the conference table. The wall where Marco had spent days outlining his vision of the future belt had been cleared, and in its place, a picture of an ancient warrior. The man was dark-skinned, with an ornate mustache and beard, a turban, a long, flowing white robe, a crimson sash with 3 swords tucked in it, and an ancient rifle cradled in one arm. "You're late," Dawes said to Marco mildly as Michio took her seat. Marco ignored them both. "Consider the Afghan," Marco said. "Lords of the graveyard of empires. Even Alexander the Great couldn't conquer these people. Every great power who attempted it exhausted themselves and failed. But they barely had a functioning economy," Sandrani said. Rosenfeld touched the other man's arm and put a finger to his own lips. Marco paced before the image. How did they manage it? How did a technologically primitive, scattered people defy the greatest powers in the world for century after century? He turned to the others. Do you know? None of them answered. They weren't meant to. This was a performance. Marco's grin widened. He lifted a hand. They cared about different things, he said. To the enemy, war was about territory, ownership, occupation. To these geniuses, it was about controlling the spaces they did not occupy. When the English armies came into an Afghan city, ready to take the field of battle, they found nothing. The enemy faded into the hills, lived in the spaces that the enemy discounted. For the English, the city was a thing to be owned. For the Afghan, it was no more sacred than the hills and the desert and the fields. That's a bit romantic, don't you think? Rosenfeld said, but Marco ignored him. These brave people, they were the belters of their age and place, our spiritual fathers, and the time has come for us to honor them. My friends, the Azure Dragon has fallen, as we knew it would eventually. Earth is preparing to lash out in its pain and ignorance. You've heard something? Dawes asked. His face was pale. Nothing new, Marco said. We always knew that Ceres was a target for them. They've been biding their time since the OPA's takeover, but our cousin Anderson here was always careful to balance his power with appeasement. It was never their greatest concern. Not until now. The UN Navy is redeploying. They are heading for Ceres. But when they get here, Marco lifted his two closed fists to his mouth, then blew on them and spread his fingers. It was an illusion, but Michio felt she could almost see the ashes blowing off his hands. You can't mean, Dawes choked. I've already started the evacuation, Marco said. All our soldiers and materiel will be off the station well before they arrive. There are 6 million people on the station, Rosenfeld said. I don't know that we can take them all. Of course not, Marco said. This is a military action. We take the military ships and supplies that we need and cede the territory to Earth. They won't let Ceres starve and die. The only thing they have is the chance to play victim and wring sympathy out of the simple-minded. If they don't take care of Ceres, they'll lose even that. And us? We'll be in the emptiness that is our natural home. Unassailable. But, Sandrani said, almost whined, the economic base. Don't worry, Marco said. Everything we've discussed is coming. Only first, we have to let the enemy overextend itself and collapse. This was always part of the plan. Dawes rose to his feet. His face was gray as ash, apart from 2 bright red smears on his cheeks. His hands shook. This is about Philip. You're getting back at me? This isn't about Philip Inaros, Marco said. But the elation and excitement had vanished from his voice. This is about Philip of Macedon, and about learning the lessons of history. He was silent for a long, terrible moment. Dawes sank back into his chair. Now, Michio and I have already discussed rerouting the incoming ships. Let's talk about the logistics of emptying the station itself. Yes? The way that inners fled their own ships when they came to a station fed a certain species of jokes about belters. How can a belter choose a ship's dinner menu? Dock. How can you tell an inner's been away from port too long? They go outside to shit. If you give an earther the choice of staying on board ship and saving her sweetheart's life, or heading out to the docks and never loving again, how do you dispose of the body? It was the way they looked at everything. The ship wasn't real. The planet was. Or the moon. or the asteroid. They couldn't let go of the idea that life involved rock and soil. It was what made them smaller. Michio's people weren't all on the comet when she passed through the docking tube and into her ship's lock, but most were. The ones who were out would likely come back to sleep in their bunks. No one would think it was odd that her whole marriage group was there. Or if it was a little odd, not implausible at least. She headed down the lift with a weird sense of seeing the ship for the first time. Like stepping into a new station, everything was in sharp focus, unfamiliar. The green and red indicators of the lift control, the thin white text printed on every panel to show what was housed behind it and when it had been installed. The subtle MCRN logo still visible on the floor, despite their best efforts to buff it away. The smell of black noodles came from the galley, but she didn't pause. If she tried to eat now, she'd only vomit anyway. They were in the cabins set aside for the family. One of the first things Berthold had done when they had got the comet was take the walls off 3 of the cabins to make a wider space with crash couches enough that they could all sit together. The Martian designers had made the ship so that the people could be alone or else together. It took a belter to make space to be alone together. Oksana and Laura were sitting on the deck, their harps almost touching as they played through an old Celtic melody. Oksana's paleness and Laura's dark made them seem like something from a fairy tale. Joseph lounged in one of the couches, his hand terminal set to some text or other, reading and swaying his foot to the music. Evan sat beside him, trying not to seem nervous. Nadia, looking like the however many greats granddaughter of Marco's Afghan soldier, stood behind one of the other couches, gently massaging Berthold's thinning black hair. Michio sat on the couch they'd left for her and listened until the melody came to an end in a series of ambiguous fourths and fifths. They put down their harps and hand terminal. Berthold opened his one good eye. "Thank you for coming," Michio said. "Always," Laura said. "Just to ask," Joseph said, "are you our captain or our wife right now?" "I'm your wife. I think that I..." And then she was weeping. She leaned forward, hands over her eyes. The tight monkey's fist knot that was her heart blocked her throat. She tried to cough it out of the way, but it sounded like a sob. Laura's hand touched her foot, and then Berthold's arm was across her back, and he folded her in against him. She heard Oksana murmuring, "It's okay, baby, it's all right," from what might have been half a world away. It was too much. It was all too much. "I did it," Michio managed at last. "I did it again. I put us in Marco's control, and he's another Ashford. He's another Fred fucking Johnson. I tried so hard not to do it again, and I did it, and I brought you all along, and I'm so sorry." Her family descended on her gently, a hand or an arm, all of them touching her, offering her comfort, saying wordlessly that they were there. Evans wept with her, not even knowing why. The tears got worse for a while, confused for a while, and then better, clearer. The worst of it passed. And when she was herself again, it was Joseph that spoke. "Tell us the story. It'll have less power then." "He's abandoning Ceres, getting all the Free Navy out and leave the people for the inners. The colony ships we took, he wants to drive them dark out of the ecliptic for storage instead of delivering the supplies." "Ah," Nadia said, "that kind, is he?" "It's hard changing," Joseph said. "Tell yourself you're a warrior long enough, you start believing it. Then peace looks like death, an annihilation of self." Little abstract, honey, Nadia said. Joseph blinked wide eyes at her, then smiled ruefully. More concrete. You're right. You always are. I'm so sorry, Michio said. I did it wrong again. I trusted someone. I put myself in his command, and I'm stupid. I'm just stupid. We all agreed, Oksana said through a scowl. We all believed. You believed because I asked you to, Michio said. This is my fault. Now, Laura said. Michi, what's the magic word? Against her will, Michio laughed. It was an old joke, a part of what made her family her family. The magic word is oops, she said. And then a moment later, oops. Bertolt took a moment to noisily blow his nose and wipe the last of the tears from his eyes. All right, so what do we do? We can't keep working with the bastard, Oksana said. Nadia nodded with her hand. And we can't stay here and wait for the Earthers. Together, without meaning to, they all looked to her, Michio, their wife, but also their captain. She took a long, shuddering breath. The thing he asked us for? Gather up the colony ships and spread the food and supplies to the belters that need them? It still needs doing, and we still have a gunship to do it with. Some of the other ships might see things our way. So either we stick to the mission, or else we try to find someplace quiet and sink out of sight before Inaros figures that we're gone. Her family was silent for what felt like a long time, though it wasn't more than a few breaths set end to end. Bertolt scratched at his bad eye. Nadia and Oksana traded a look that seemed to mean something. Laura cleared her throat. Being small isn't being safe. Not now. Vrai, Bertolt said. I'm for doing what we said we'd do. And fuck the rest. Changed sides before and it didn't kill us. Did we? Joseph said. Would we be changing sides now? Yes, Evans said. We would. Joseph turned to look Michio full in the eyes. The humor and love in his face was like warmth radiating from a heater. Fought the oppressor before, still fighting the oppressor now. Followed your heart then, still following your heart now. The situation changes. That doesn't mean you do. That's sweet, Michio said, taking his hand. Abstract, though, Nadia said. And there was love in her voice, too. Everything you've done, Joseph said. Every mistake, every loss, every scar. They all brought you here. So that as soon as you saw Big himself for what he is, you'd be ready to act. Incapable of not acting, even. Everything then was preparation for now. That's bullshit, Michio said. But thank you. If the universe needs a knife, it makes a knife, Joseph said with a shrug. If it needs a pirate queen, it makes Michio Pa. Chapter 12. Holden. The wall screen in the dock's public lobby was tuned to an entertainment news feed. A breathtakingly pretty young woman with one eyelid that was either rouged or tattooed red was being interviewed by someone off-screen. The crawler at the bottom of the screen identified her as Zedina Rael. Holden wasn't sure who she was. The sound was on, but incomprehensible over the sound of the people moving through the lobby to or from the docks. The subtitles were in Hindi. On the screen, Rael shook her head and a thick tear dripped down her cheek as the feed shifted to images of a ruined city under a filthy brown sky. So, something about the situation on Earth. It was easy to forget that the entertainment feeds, musicians and actors and celebrities for the sake of celebrity, were all going to be as affected by the catastrophe as everybody else. It felt like that slice of reality should be separate, inviolate. Plagues and wars and disasters weren't supposed to impinge on the manufactured world of entertainment, but of course they did. Zadina Rael, whatever she did that got her a place on the screen, was a human being too, and had probably lost someone she loved when the rocks fell. Would probably lose more. Captain Holden. The man was thick-shouldered and dark-haired with a sharp goatee. He carried an air of exhaustion and good humor along with his hand terminal. His uniform identified him as Port Control, and his name badge read Bates. Sorry there. You've been waiting long? Nope, Holden said, taking the proffered terminal. Just a few minutes. Things are busy, Bates said. Not a problem, Holden said as he signed and pressed his thumb to the reader pad. The terminal chimed. It was a small, happy sound. Like the terminal was very happy Holden had authorized the delivery. Got you in bay H-15? Bates said. We'll have that unloaded for you right away. Who's your repair coordinator? We've got our own, Holden said. Naomi Nagata. Right, of course, the man said, nodded once and was gone. On the screen, Zadina Rael had been replaced by a thick-featured Ifra McCoy. At least, Holden knew who she was. The invisible interviewer said something, and a lull in the background noise let him hear the answer. There must be a response. We have to stand up. The frustration and pain in McCoy's voice bothered him, and he didn't know if it was because he agreed with her or because he was afraid what that response would lead to. He turned back toward the docks proper and the work at hand. In a spin station like Tycho or the Lagrange stations, the ship would have been parked in vacuum. Luna was another thing entirely. The shipyard had vast locks dug deep into the lunar body with tugs to guide ships in and out, retractable seals, air. The Rocinante stood upright, drive cone toward the center of the moon and chisel tip upper decks toward the stars, held in a webwork of scaffolding. The space was large enough to house a ship 3 times her size, and all of it was filled with breathable air. Racks of construction mechs stood against the wall except for the 4 that were on the Rocinante, crawling gently over its surface like spiders on a crow. Naomi was in one, Amos in another. The third was Sandra Ip, one of the 2 engineers who Fred Johnson had brought on as the Rosie's crew for the flight to Luna when the real crew, Les Holden, had scattered to the void. Alex and Bobby stood on a raised platform, looking up at the body of the ship. The damage the Free Navy had done was knotted as a scar and bright. Wide panels, the newly delivered sections of hull, rose up the ship and scaffold, guided by massive Waldos. Alex held out a headset, and Holden connected it to his hand terminal, shifting to the full crew channel. How's it looking? He asked. They did a number on us, Naomi said. I'm impressed. Always easier to break things than put them together, Holden said. More evidence for that, Naomi agreed with a belter nod of the fist. And these replacement sections... Problem? Sandra Ip's voice answered. It was a little jarring to hear an unfamiliar voice. They're carbon silicate lace, state-of-the-art, lighter, stronger. These things can deflect a glancing PDC round. Defensiveness just below the surface told Holden this wasn't the first time through the conversation. They can for now, Naomi said. Holden switched his mic to the Rocinante-only channel, but kept listening on the full crew. So, just between the family here? What's the issue with the new plates? Nothing, Naomi said. They're great. Everything it says on the tin. But 5 years from now? 10? They don't age well? Well, that's the thing, Alex drawled. Ain't none of this stuff 10 years old yet. The materials science folks got a kick in the pants after the protomolecule. Bunches of new toys. Lace plating's just one. In theory, it should hold up just like the real thing. In practice, we're the practice. I had a hell of a time convincing the Rosie I wasn't putting in the wrong mass for them, too. It's going to change how she handles. Holden crossed his arms. Above him, the Waldos shifted the new hull section in, laying it along the Rosie's side. Are we sure we want to do this? We can hold out for the regular kind. Not if we want to get out of Tycho anytime soon, we can't, Naomi said. There's a war on. We can turn down the contract, Holden said. Fred can find another ride. I don't know, Cap, Amos said. Things being what they are, I kind of like that we're getting work. I mean, as long as money still works. He paused. Hey, does money still work? It does if we win, Naomi said. Free Navy ports weren't going to refit and refuel us anyway. Right, Amos said. So I kind of like that we're getting work. Two of the mechs scuttled forward to the edge of the new hull plate. Welding torches like little suns burst into life, cleaving old technology and new together. There was something about it that Holden disliked and distrusted. But there was also something amazing. The very fabric the lace hull was made from hadn't existed when he was born, and now it did. Vast intelligences had designed the protomolecule, the rings, the weird and implacable ruins that covered all the new worlds. They might be extinct, but they were also being incorporated into what humanity knew, what it could do, how it defined itself. A kid born today would grow up in a world where carbon silicate lace was as common as titanium or glass. That it was a collaboration between humanity and the ghosts of a massive and alien intelligence would go right by them. Holden was one of the lucky generation who would straddle that breakpoint, that seam between before and after that Naomi and Amos and Ip were making literal right now. And so he could be amazed by how cool it was. Creepy, but cool. It's the future, he said. We might as well get some practice with it. The rest of Fred Johnson's temporary crew was either already on the Rocinante, along with Clarissa, or on the way from their quarters on Luna. There was an excitement about the coming action. It was the first time that they, Earth, Mars, and even the less radical splinters of the OPA, would work together to take any direct action against the Free Navy. The heavy lifting would be done by Earth and Mars, but the Rocinante would be there. An observation ship carrying Fred Johnson. A representative, however imperfect, of the belt. They were ready. Except that Holden also wasn't. Especially now that his parents had come up the well from Earth. The impulse to stay close surprised him. He'd spent most of his adult life off-planet. If anyone asked him, he'd have told them that he didn't miss Earth. Some people, yes. Some places from his childhood, maybe. But there'd been no sense of longing for the planet itself. It was only now that it had been attacked that he wanted to protect it. Maybe it was always like that. He'd outgrown his childhood home, but in the back of his mind, the unexamined assumption was that it would still be there. Changed, maybe. Grown a little older, but there. Only it wasn't now. Wanting to stay was the same as wanting to go back a little in time, to when it hadn't happened. Fred Johnson sent a message. He and weapons technicians Sunyi Steinberg and Gordroga were finishing their last meeting. As soon as the new hull was welded into place and the pressure tests complete, they could go. If Holden had any last business on Luna, this was the time for it. He had some last business on Luna. The torches flared and died and flared again. The Rocinante was remade a little, the same way it had been over and over through the years. Little changes adding up over time as the ship moved from what it had been to what it would be next. just like all the people she carried. "You okay?" Bobby asked. "What?" Holden said. "You were sighing," she said. "He does that sometimes," Alex said. "I do?" Holden said, realizing as he did that Bobby was still looped in on the Rocinante-only channel, that he was glad she was. "I didn't know I did that." "Don't worry about it," Naomi said. "It's cute." "So?" he said. "When you're done with that, Naomi, Fred's on his way." "Yeah," she said. And he was probably just imagining the dread in her voice. "All right." The cart that drove them down toward the refugee station ran on electromagnetic track that held the wheels to the ground. Part grumble, part chime, the sound was loud enough that Holden felt he had to raise his voice a little to be heard over it. "If she's still being paid through the UN or Mars, that would be different," Holden said. "If we're offering her a place on the ship permanently, I just think we need to be careful about how we do it." "She's good," Naomi said. "She's actually trained for a ship like the Rosie, which is more than any of us can say. She gets along with the crew. Why wouldn't you want Bobby on board?" The air in the deeper corridors was damp and close. The environmental systems were working at their full capacity and a little bit more. People shuffled out of the cart's way, some staring at them as they passed, some not seeming to look at anything. The refugee station stank of loss and waiting. Almost every person they passed was a lifetime that had been severed from its roots. Holden and Naomi were the lucky ones here. They still had their home, even if it was a changed one. "It's not Bobby," Holden said. "Of course I want Bobby. But the terms. Do we pay her? Do we redistribute ownership of the Rosie so that she's got the same stake in her that all of us do? I'm not sure that's a good idea." Naomi looked at him, her eyebrows rising. "Why not?" "Because whatever we do with Bobby sets the precedent for what we do with any other crew we bring on." "Meaning Clarissa." "I don't want to give Clarissa now ownership of the Rosie," Holden said. She's here and okay, fine. I'm still not sanguine about that, but I can deal with it. And I want to bring Bobby all the way into the crew, but I can't. I can't agree that Clarissa ever gets to call my ship her home. That's the difference between letting her be there and pretending she's like Bobby. Or you, or me. "No forgiveness?" Naomi asked, halfway between teasing and serious. "Plenty of forgiveness. Loads of forgiveness. Some boundaries, too." The cart lurched to the left, slowed. The chiming sound cycled lower as it stopped. Father Anton was waiting at the door, smiling and nodding to them as they lifted themselves out and shuffled forward. The quarters for Holden's parents were better than most. The suite was tight and too small, but private. His mothers and fathers didn't have to share it with anyone outside the family. Mother Tamara's yellow curry scented the air. Father Tom and Father Cesar stood in the doorway to one of the bedrooms, arms around each other's hips. Father Dmitri leaned against the arm of an old sofa, while Mother Elise and Mother Tamara came in from the little kitchen. Father Joseph and Mother Sophie sat on the couch, a thin magnetic chess set between them, the pieces scattered by their game. Everyone was smiling, including him, and none of them meant it. It was goodbye again. When he'd left for his doomed tour in the Navy, there'd been a moment like this, too. A leave-taking that meant something they couldn't be sure of. Maybe he'd be back in a few weeks, or never. Maybe they'd be here on Luna, or transfer to L4, or something else might happen. Without the farm and decades of social inertia to hold them together, maybe they would break apart. A sudden oceanic sadness washed through Holden, and he had to fight to keep it from showing. Protecting his parents from his distress one more time, just the way they were doing for him. One by one, and then in groups, they hugged. Mother Elise held Naomi's hand and told her to take care of her little boy. Naomi solemnly agreed that she'd do what she could. If this might be the last time he had his parents all together, he was grateful that Naomi was there to be part of it, right up until Father Cesar said goodbye. Cesar's skin was wrinkled as a turtle's, dark as fresh-turned earth. There were tears in his eyes as he took Holden's hand. "You did good, boy. You made everyone proud of you." "Thank you," Holden said. "You go give those fucking skinnies hell, yeah?" Over Cesar's left shoulder, Naomi went stiff. Her smile, which had been soft and warm and amused, became polite. Holden felt it like a punch in the gut. But Cesar didn't even seem to know that he'd said something rude. Holden was trapped between asking his father to apologize and preserving this last moment. Naomi, talking to Mother Tamara, plucked at her hair, pulled it over her eyes. "Shit." "You know," Holden said, that's what he'll do," Naomi said. "You can count on Jim." Her eyes were on his, and they were hard and dark. "Don't make this more awkward than it already is," glowed in them as clearly as if she'd written it. Holden grinned, hugged Father Cesar one last time, and started the retreat to the door, the cart, the Rocinante. All 8 of his parents crowded outside the door to watch him go. He felt them there even when the cart turned the corner and started up the ramp toward the docks. Naomi sat silently. Holden sighed. "Okay," he said. "I see now why you didn't want to do that. I'm really sorry that—" "Don't," Naomi said. "Let's don't. I think I owe you an apology." She shifted to look straight at him. "Your father owes me an apology. One of your fathers. But I'm going to let him off the hook." "All right," Holden said. The cart lurched to the right. A man with a thick beard trotted out of their way. "I was going to defend you. I know you were. I would have. I know. And then I would have been the reason that everything had gotten weird and everyone would have gone out of their way to tell me how they respect Belters and how he didn't mean me. And you're their son. And they love you. And they love each other. So no matter what anyone said, it would all have been my fault." "Yeah," Holden said. "But then I wouldn't feel as bad about it. And I feel kind of bad about it." "Cross you'll have to bear, sweetie," Naomi said. She sounded tired. At the dock, Fred Johnson's crew was loading the last of the supplies into the cargo airlock. The new lace hull panels stood out on the Rosie's side like scars. The cart, having dropped them off, rumbled and chimed itself away. Holden paused for a moment, looking up at the ship. His heart was complicated. "Yeah?" Naomi said. "Nothing," Holden said, and then a moment later, "There was a time I thought things were simple, or that at least some things were. He didn't mean me. No, really, he didn't. Because I'm a person to him, and skinnies and belters, they aren't people. I had friends on the Pella. Real friends, people I grew up with, people I cared about, people I loved. They aren't any different. They didn't kill people. They killed Earthers, Martians, Dusters, Squats." "Squats?" "Yup. Hadn't heard that one." She put her hand in his, shifted her body against his, reached up to rest her chin on the top of his head. "It's considered rude." Holden leaned against her as much as the weak gravity would allow. He felt the warmth of her body against his, felt the rise and fall of her breath. "We're not people," he said. We're the stories that people tell each other about us. Belters are crazy terrorists. Earthers are lazy gluttons. Martians are cogs in a great big machine. Men are fighters, Naomi said. And then, her voice growing bleak, women are nurturing and sweet, and they stay home with the kids. It's always been like that. We always react to the stories about people, not who they really are. And look where it got us, Holden said. Chapter 13. Prax. The thing that surprised him the most when it all changed was how little it all changed, at least in the beginning. Between the trailing end of the reconstruction and the rising tide of research projects, Prax sometimes went days or weeks without looking at news feeds. Anything interesting in the greater sphere of humanity he heard about in the conversations of others. When he'd heard that the governing board was putting out a declaration of neutrality, he thought it was about gas sequestration and exchange. He hadn't even known there was a war until Parvanides told him. Ganymede knew too much about being a battlefield already. The collapse was too recent in their collective memory, the scars still fresh and raw. There were ice-flooded corridors still unexcavated after the last outbreak of violence, back before the Ring Gate, back before the opening of the 1300 worlds. No one wanted that again. And so Ganymede said it didn't care who ran things, just so long as they could continue their research, care for the people in their hospitals, and go about their lives. A massive, we're busy, you figure it out, to the universe in general. And then, nothing. No one claimed them or threatened them. No one fired nukes at them, or if they had, the weapons hadn't landed and the event hadn't made the news. So much of Ganymede's food was locally sourced, no one worried about going hungry. Prax had some concerns about research funding, but after the first few times he brought it up and had the issue swept aside, he'd stopped trying. They were in a holding pattern. They were keeping their heads down, doing the things they'd always done, hoping no one took notice. And so Prax's daily trip between his hole and May's school and his offices had been weirdly unchanged. The food carts in the station served the same fried corn mash and bitter tea. The project management meetings continued on Mondays before lunch. The generations of plant and fungus and yeast and bacteria lived and died and were analyzed just the way they would have been if no one had crippled Earth or killed it. When belters in Free Navy uniforms started appearing on the corners, no one said anything. When the Free Navy ships had started demanding resupply, their scrip had been added to the approved list of currencies and their contracts drawn up. When loyalists who'd filled their boards and feeds with support for Earth and demands that the governing board take a stand went silent, no one talked about it. It was just understood. Ganymede's neutrality was permitted so long as the Free Navy could enforce it. Marco Inaros, who Prax had never heard of before the rocks fell, might not control the base, but he was quite willing to prune away the people who did until the organizational chart had been bonsaied into the shape that pleased him. Pay tribute to the Free Navy and govern yourself. Rebel and be killed. So nothing much changed, and also everything did. The tension was there every day, in every interaction, however mundane. And it came out at strange times, like reviewing trial report data. Fuck the animal trials, Parvanides said, her face tight and angry. Forget them. This is ready to go into production. Kana crossed his arms, scowling at her. Prax, confused, had only the data to turn to, so he turned to it. Harvester yeast strain 18, sequence 10, was doing very well. The production numbers, sugars and protein both, were slightly above expected. Lipids were inside the error bars. It had been a good run. But his office was spare and close. The same room he'd taken when he brought May back from Luna. The first office of his tenure on the Reconstruction Committee. The others on the committee had moved on to larger places with bamboo paneling and augmented spectrum lights. But Prax liked being where he already was. The familiar had always offered a powerful comfort. If Kana and Karvanides had worked in any other section, there would have been a couch, or at least soft chairs for them to sit on. The lab stools in Prax's office were also the same ones he'd had his first day back. Prax said, then coughed, looked down. I don't see why we break protocol. That seems, completely irresponsible, Kana said. I think the phrase is completely irresponsible. What's irresponsible is sitting on this, Karvanides said. 2 additions to the genome, 50 generations of growth, so less than 3 days, and we have a species that can beat chloroplasts for making sugars out of light and extends out almost into gamma, plus the proteins and micronutrients. Use this for reactor shielding and you can shut down the recycler. That's hyperbole, Kana said. And this is protomolecule technology. If you think, it is not. There is literally nothing in high 1810 that comes from an alien sample. We looked at the protomolecule, said, it can't do that, can we? And figured out how to make something of our own. Native proteins, native DNA, native catalysts. Nothing that traces back to Phoebe or the Ring or anything that came off Illis or Roe or New London ever touched this. That, Prax said, that doesn't mean it's safe, though. The animal protocol, safe? Karvanides said, wheeling on him. There are people starving to death all over the earth right now. How safe are they? Oh, Prax thought. This isn't anger. It's grief. Prax understood grief. Kana leaned forward, his hands and fists. But before he could speak, Prax put up his palm. He was in charge here, after all. It didn't hurt to actually exercise his power now and then. We'll continue with the animal protocol, he said. It's better science. We could save lives, Karvanides said. Her voice was softer now. One message. I have a friend at Guangdong Complex. She'd be able to replicate it. I'm not going to be part of this conversation, Kana said. The door slammed closed behind him so hard that the latch didn't hold. The door ghosted open again, like someone invisible was coming in to take his place. Karvanides sat, her hands on Prax's desk. Dr. Meng, before you say no, I want you to come with me. There's a meeting tonight, just a few people. Hear us out. Then, if you really don't want to help, I won't bring it up to you again. I swear. Her eyes were dark enough, it was hard to tell iris from pupil. He looked back down at the data. She was probably right, in her way. High 1810 wasn't the first yeast that had been modified with radioplasts, and High 1808 and most of the High 17 runs had been in animal trials for months without any statistically significant ill effects. With things on Earth as bad as they were, the risk of High 1810 having adverse effects was almost certainly lower than the dangers of starvation. His stomach felt tight and anxious. He wanted to leave. It's proprietary, he said, hearing the whine in his voice as he said it. Even if we could ethically release it, the legal consequences, not just for us, but for the labs in general, would be, just come hear us out, Karvanides said. You won't have to say anything. You won't even have to talk. Prax grunted, a little chuffing sound that centered behind his nose, like an angry rat. I have a daughter, he said. The silence between them went on for the space of a breath, then another. Then, of course, sir. I understand. She stood up, Her stool scraped against the flooring. It sounded cheap. The urge to say something fluttered in his chest, but he didn't know what it would be, and before he found it, she was gone. She closed the door more gently than Connor had, but with a greater finality. Prax sat, scratching at his arm, though it didn't itch. Then he closed the report. The rest of the day was filled with his own work in the hydroponics lab. His new project was a modified firm built for water and air purification. They stood in long rows, fronds bobbing in the constant and well-regulated breeze. The leaves, so green they were almost black, smelled familiar and welcoming. The embedded sensors had been gathering data since the day before, and he looked it over like sitting with an old friend. Plants were so much easier than people. When that was done, he stopped back by his office, returned half a dozen messages, and reviewed the meetings scheduled for the next morning. It was all routine. All the same things he'd done before the rocks hit Earth. It was like a ritual. Today, though, he took the extra step of adding an administrative lock on the high 1810 data. He tried not to think too much about why he'd done it. Something vague fluttered in the back of his mind about being able to show he'd done all he could do. He wasn't sure who he imagined he'd be defending himself before, but he didn't really want to think about that. He felt nervous during his walk to the tube station. The pale tile walls, the arching ceiling above the platform, all of it was just as it had been ever since the rebuild. It only seemed ominous because of all the things in his own head. While he waited for his tube, he bought a wax paper cone of fried bean curd with olive oil and salt. The vendor was an earther, and Prax noted the way the man had kept his hair and beard long, letting them grow out from his skull to mimic the slightly larger heads of true belters. The man's skin was dark, so the OPA tattoos on his hands and neck didn't stand out as much as they could have. Cryptic coloration, Prax thought as the chime announced the tube's arrival. Probably a good idea. It was interesting to see how humanity adopted the strategies you saw anywhere in nature. They were part...
Okay, tomorrow I will start the shading on my flower, and then I will start the other bolster on the other hand. I know you cannot see much because there is too much reflection, but let's see if it makes any difference. No. Oh, yes, it does. So I did do several flowers, you can see. And tomorrow I will do the shading on my flower. I will start on the other bolster, on the other hand of the handle. And eventually I will do the shading on my bird. But I'm not ready to do that now. That's all for today. And good night.